She would come every week and she would sit down, and if she sat too close to people, people would get up and move away from her. They didn't want to be associated with her or sit near her. Hello, welcome to another week of Mix It Up, Black History and the Restoration. I am Taylor Ricks, and this is where we mix up a recipe while we mix up the restoration by learning about early Black members of the church. Today we're going to make an easy dump cake. I've seen it all over the internet, but I'm actually trying it for the first time today. Although I do make dump cakes when I have to follow like strict allergy guidelines, because I'm doing a gluten-free meal today, so I get a gluten-free cake mix or brownie mix. This one's from Trader Joe's, and then these are the new gluten-free Oreos, and then it just makes it easier. Everything else is already gluten-free because I am not naturally very good at it, but I am giving it to someone who needs gluten-free. So these dump cakes make it easy when you're trying to follow like different allergy guides and make it taste a little fancier than just a regular box-made cake. So that is what we're doing today, and we're going to be talking about Esther Jane James. You'll remember last week we talked about Henry Leggroan. This is his wife, Esther. And Esther, she was born on Valentine's Day, 1869. Her mom was Mary Ann Perkins, and she was born as a slave to a member, the Perkins family in Salt Lake. And when they were emancipated, then she was able to marry Sylvester James. Sylvester, sorry, I said his name weird. He is the son of Jane Elizabeth Manning James. So he was free. And you'll remember that Jane knocked on the door of the endowment house, and that's where she met Emma and the prophet Joseph Smith in Nauvoo. And she was an active member. She walked with her feet bleeding. There's a movie made about her. Well, Sylvester is her oldest son. And so he is the dad of Esther Jane James. So that is her grandma. Jane Elizabeth Manning James is Esther's grandma. So she actually went by Jane just like her grandma did, even though her first name is Esther. So she has that rich heritage, and when she married Henry Leggroan, her dad Sylvester gave him and her 2 acres in the Mill Creek area to start their own farm. And so they lived near her family, and you'll remember that Henry's family moved and settled Idaho. So they didn't live near Henry's family, but they lived near Esther Jane's family. And they lived in the Wilford ward. Her dad, Sylvester, ended up getting excommunicated, but her mom, Mary Ann Perkins, stayed active her entire life and raised her children in the church. And so Jane stayed active her entire life as well and remained in the church. You'll also remember that they had 7 children and that one of her children passed away. So while she lived on the farm, her husband Henry, that we talked about last week, did a lot of odd jobs, and she did a lot of, this does not go first. The whipped cream goes first. We'll just pretend that didn't happen. Okay. She did a lot of the odd jobs around the farm. Probably most of the farm hand work, it sounds like, while he was off doing other jobs to earn money. She made sure that nothing that they grew went to waste. So when they grew like grain, she used part of it to feed the animals. She used another part of the plant. I know nothing about the plant, so I can't tell you what part was what. She used another part of the plant to like make into flour, and she used another part of the plant to preserve some of their other crops. She would dig these long trenches and line them with the throwaway parts of the grain, and then she would put like the cabbage, potatoes, and carrots, and she would put them root facing up instead of root facing down in these trenches, and then cover them with dirt. And that's how she would preserve those for her family to eat throughout the winter. So she used every part of everything she had. One of her daughters explained that they didn't have very much money back then, but you didn't need very much money back then. At least that's how their family felt, because they were able to figure out other ways to take care of their family through just being industrious and using everything that came, canning all their fruits and vegetables, that kind of thing. Esther Jane was also really talented seamstress. She was a really talented seamstress, but they said that the fabric was one of the only things she had to buy. A lot of everything else that they needed, they grew or traded other people for. And so her daughters would go work and keep house for different families and things like that to earn money for the fabric. And her daughters would say that she actually would make really fashionable and quite cute, is the quote, quite cute clothing for them, and they were really happy with it because she was just so talented in that area. She went to church every single Relief Society, every single Sunday. Her neighbor, Sister Clayton, said that she was always there, but and this is from Sister Clayton's perspective. I don't have Esther Jane's perspective, but Sister Clayton said she felt like Esther Jane was kind of not really welcomed. She was kind of kept on the margins, which we talked about last week, but she said that she would come every week and she would sit down, and if she sat too close to people, people would get up and move away from her. They didn't want to be associated with her or sit near her. They would purposely sit far away from her if she was already seated. But she said almost every week people would do that. They wouldn't listen to what she had to say. They wouldn't really talk to her. She was just kind of out by herself. And what's interesting is she's like, but like bishops and leaders, different people were sometimes nice to her. They just wouldn't like talk to her and include her. And I think that as I thought about that, I was like, oh, they were nice to her. And then I was like, wait, I don't think you can be both. I don't think you can be nice to someone and then not sit by them and move away from them in Relief Society. And so I think that this story kind of brought to light to mind the fact that I think sometimes we act like we're doing better than we think we are, or we make excuses or something like, oh, they were really friendly, they were welcoming, they just wouldn't sit by her. You can't have both. And so I think that this story, as well as Henry's story that we talked about last week, has caused me to kind of spend some time in reflection on how do I do that? How do I say that I'm either being welcoming, but then my actions aren't welcoming, just my words are, or how am I professing one aspect of the gospel, but then not quite living it? So this story has kind of given me some pause and some reflection in that area of what do I feel like, what do I maybe feel like I'm doing well that I'm not? And so anyway, that was kind of a tangent. But Esther Jane, regardless of how her ward members accepted or didn't accept her, went to church, went to Relief Society during the week, did all of those things her whole life. Sister Clayton was also her next door neighbor, and she said that whenever one of her children were sick, that Esther Jane was the first one there to help like provide meals or to help her take care of her children. And you know, if we remember, they lived on farms, so if someone was sick, it didn't mean that like the work just ended. We couldn't just be like, hey, today we're focusing on the sick person. So she said that Esther Jane would come and help take care of things around her home, as well as taking care of her own homestead. And she just said she was always the first to offer service, but she rarely would accept it, or almost never would accept service. She remembers one time the Relief Society put together like a welfare basket of different foods and vegetables and produce for her family around Thanksgiving time. And Esther Jane said, no, we have everything we need. There's probably a different family that needs this more, and turned it down and wouldn't accept it because she was just self-sufficient and really took good care of herself and her family. So Esther Jane's husband Henry passed away 6 months before she did in the year 1845. And they are both buried next to each other in that same little quaint cemetery in northern Utah. Esther Jane James is an amazing example of, even when things get hard, even when we get offended, even when we may not feel welcome, that the gospel really is all about our relationship with our Savior Jesus Christ. And I don't know why Esther kept going back to church week after week, even though that had to have been so difficult. But I would imagine it's because she knew her Savior Jesus Christ so well and had a personal relationship with him, because for me that would be the only way I could keep going back under those circumstances. So it's my guess, and I would imagine that she has a similar story and circumstance, and I can't wait to hear from her own mouth what her story is. But what a great example she is, and what a beautiful lesson her story is of learning to be accepting and welcoming of everyone, regardless of race, nationality, belief, whatever it may be, that we can create room for everyone. Thank you so much for coming to week 20 of Mix It Up, Black History and the Restoration. I am Taylor Ricks, and I will see you all next week. Goodbye.